and welcome to a brand new edition of WION-VOA Co-Production. I am Molly Gambhir. Our top focus in this edition, Congressional Democrats are introducing a legislation to suspend U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia after the kingdom sided with Russia to cut oil production at last week's OPEC Plus meeting. The White House says President Joe Biden is open to working closely with the Congress to recalibrate ties with Riyadh. VOA's senior diplomatic correspondent, Saine, reporting.
OPEC Plus cut its oil production target by 2 million barrels last week, despite U.S. objections, prompting some U.S. lawmakers to demand tough action against cartel leader Saudi Arabia. President Joe Biden said he will work closely with Congress on the issue when members return to Capitol Hill after midterm elections next month.
We're going to react to Saudi Arabia, and they're doing consultation when they come back, and we will take action.
On Capitol Hill, 2 Democratic lawmakers introduced legislation to stop U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia, saying Riyadh was the driving force in the OPEC Plus decision to cut the global oil supply during Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
The complexity of these issues go way beyond just a single decision on oil, and the president is absolutely right to be considered and deliberate. We regard this legislation as sensible and reasonable. It's targeting a specific decision. The one-sided relationship has been documented.
Saudi Arabia has said the OPEC Plus decision is unanimous and based on economic considerations. OPEC Plus refers to the grouping of 23 oil exporting nations that decide how much to sell on the world market. It includes Russia. A co-sponsor of the legislation said Saudi Arabia made a bad decision to side with Russia, perhaps because of its experience with the administration of former U.S. President Donald Trump.
I believe the Saudis have consistently been miscalculating in the past couple of years, and it's probably because Trump candidly gave them carte blanche. And what President Biden is trying to do is just return to the proper balance.
Under Crown Prince and Prime Minister Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia is not an ally of the United States. Aaron David Miller, senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a former Middle East analyst and negotiator, told VOA.
And what the Saudi Crown Prince did to literally undermine the president's political position, certainly with respect to oil prices, weeks before midterms, and at the same time, undermine the president's position, international community's position, in an effort to isolate Vladimir Putin in terms of his aggression against Ukraine by supporting him politically and economically.
Republican senators have not been as vocal about taking action against Saudi Arabia, although some have spoken up about the kingdom's human rights abuses in the past, as Brian Katulis, Vice President of Policy at the Middle East Institute, told VOA via Zoom.
Some of those senators from gas-producing states in the United States were deeply concerned about 2 years ago when Saudi Arabia and others, OPEC Plus, took certain decisions that led to a severe drop in the price of oil. So there's not I think the broader picture is that from a bipartisan basis, the U.S.-Saudi relationship is not on a stable foundation.
The White House has rejected criticism of President Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia in July, saying it was not about oil, but about demonstrating the ongoing U.S. commitment to the Middle East. Saine, VOA News.
And let's get in further details. Jessica has been tracking all those inputs for us. Jessica Stone is joining us on the broadcast. Tell us more about the way things stand with neither side backing down. Can the relationship head for a full breakdown? And does it hurt President Biden domestically and internationally?
Well, certainly the timing of this OPEC decision to cut production by 2 million barrels a day could not come at a worse time politically for President Biden and his party. We're just a month from the midterm elections. Fuel and food prices, inflation prices, inflationary pressures, I should say, of any kind are really front and center for American voters. Saudi Arabia counters that, look, this was economic timing. We couldn't delay this vote any longer. But certainly the White House is pushing back heavily, saying that some members, they say, of OPEC have actually told them they were coerced into voting at this time. And they are very much re-examining the relationship with Saudi Arabia. Fuel prices, as I say, front and center for American voters. Food prices as well. And internationally, that's the case, too, as we've talked about many times on the broadcast. That a Black Sea grain deal is going to be reconsidered this weekend. And of course, many countries around the world depend on grain from Russia and Ukraine. That Black Sea grain deal was getting them that grain and sort of helping to ease the inflationary pressures around the world. But Russia now saying that it is prepared to walk away from that deal entirely if its complaints are not addressed. Meantime, we're seeing a little bit more of a pattern out of Moscow, saying that they are open to talks to end the conflict in Ukraine. That certainly seems to be coming with increased frequency after their multiple military defeats there recently.
Right. The Russia-Ukraine war also in focus at the semi-annual international financial meetings in Washington, D.C. Get us up to speed with what's coming out of them in terms of support for Ukraine's economy and, of course, the global economy, which is also bearing the brunt of rising food and fuel prices.
Absolutely. And of course, Washington right now just getting to the White House today, gridlock, in part because of the IMF World Bank meetings, which occur just around the corner from the White House. So there's a lot of dignitaries in town for that. And much of the focus, as you say, is on Ukraine. The World Bank has just committed another $500 million in economic aid to the Ukraine. That comes after the IMF pledged another $1.3 billion to help prop up the nation's economy as it continues its fight against Russia. President Zelensky, though, asking for much bigger numbers. He met with the finance ministers this week virtually, asking for $55 billion to rebuild the infrastructure, steady the country's economy. But inflation and rapidly rising interest rates around the world are really cutting into the global growth forecast. We're seeing the IMF and the World Bank both predict a slowing growth, much slower than they had initially anticipated, in part due to the war in Ukraine, also the China zero COVID policy, as well as the inflationary pressures coming out of the Federal Reserve. And just to put a bow on it here, Molly, the IMF managing director saying that the economic slowdown will wipe out $4 trillion in global economic growth over the next 3 years. That is the size of Germany's economy.
Right. Stay on with me, Jessica. Let's also talk about a new report that warns that in cities the world over, China has opened dozens of overseas police service centers, some of which blackmail criminal suspects into returning home to face charges in breach of globally accepted extradition laws. As Henry Ridgwell reports from London, some fear the networks could target political dissidents as well.
A video produced in 2020 by the Li Shui City Prosecutor's Office in China. Local Chinese associations in Spain have tracked down a suspect wanted for environmental pollution back home. At a so-called overseas police service centre in Madrid, he is questioned remotely by police in China. Sitting alongside them is a representative of the suspect's family. The prosecutor's video says the suspect was persuaded to return home to face charges. It is a disturbing new tactic, says Laura Half, a co-author of the report from the human rights group Safeguard Defenders.
Which basically means like threatening, harassing family members, relatives back home to have the so-called fugitive, the person abroad, voluntarily, as they call it, return to China.
Spain confirmed it is investigating the incident. Chinese authorities boast that between April 2021 and July 2022, they persuaded over 230,000 Chinese nationals, mostly living in Southeast Asia, to return home to face criminal proceedings. The report says China has opened at least 54 police service centres on 5 continents, according to freely available official documents. 3 are listed in Britain, including this address in North London. The businesses operating here denied any links to the Chinese government. They declined an interview with VOA. Most of the local Chinese community told VOA they did not know about the overseas police centres and did not want to be interviewed on camera.
The Chinese regime is becoming increasingly brazen, its institutions increasingly brazen in pursuing this illegal means across the globe and not even hiding it very well. I mean, equally worrying is the fact that democratic governments are apparently not very aware or even concerned about this happening on their soil in violation of their territorial sovereignty.
The British government told VOA that any foreign country operating on UK soil must abide by UK law, but did not confirm whether it was investigating. Fin Lau knows well the long reach of the Chinese Communist Party. As a leader of the 2019 Hong Kong protests against Beijing, he was sought by police and fled to Britain. Then in 2020, on a street close to his London home, he was attacked by 3 masked men who he is convinced were working for the Chinese government.
I don't really feel safe in London, especially after the physical or near-death assault in London. Because, for years we have many different Hong Kong and Chinese citizens being followed or assaulted by the Chinese Communist Party by different means.
In an email to VOA, the Chinese embassy in London said the Safeguard Defenders report is rife with speculation and lies, adding that China fully respects judicial sovereignty. The report authors say that, at best, these police service centres help Chinese diaspora and tourists with everyday problems. But at worst, they could be part of a complex global web of surveillance and control, allowing the Communist Party to reach far beyond China's borders. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
And let's go back across to Jessica Stone, who's standing by right outside the White House there. Jessica, U.S. President Joe Biden has finally released his national security strategy, which names Russia and China as major security threats. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, well, it was delayed because it was supposed to be out over the winter time, but that was when the United States began to get intelligence indicating that Russia was about to invade Ukraine. And so they held off. They just put it out earlier this week. And in it, Biden calls Russia a short-term threat. What he really does is hone in on China as a long-term threat and says that the U.S. should have a relentless focus on countering China along several different axes: diplomacy, security, military, cyber, and space. Why, you might ask? Well, he says, quote, China is the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to advance that directive. Quoting now. What is very new here, though, in the document is that it really breaks down the traditional divide between domestic and foreign policy as it pertains to the United States. And this is something we started to see under President Trump. It has certainly moved forward under President Biden. The idea that investing particularly in technology manufacturing, semiconductors in particular here in the United States, will only make U.S. foreign policy stronger. So that's a big advancement in thinking here in Washington. Molly?
We're leaving it there for the moment. Thanks very much, Jessica, for getting us those details and inputs. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of WION-VOA Co-Production. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.